It was a typical morning in the bustling city, where towering buildings cast long shadows over the streets below. The sidewalks were crowded with people rushing to work, their heads buried in their phones or focused straight ahead, unaware of the lives they passed by. Among them was Derek Calloway, a self-made millionaire whose every step resonated with confidence. Dressed in an impeccable suit, he walked with purpose, oblivious to the world around him. His day was packed with meetings, deals, and decisions that would impact his ever-expanding empire. Derek had grown accustomed to the rhythms of success, to the applause of those around him. In his mind, the world was divided into two groups, those who made it and those who didn't. Today, however, he would come face to face with a truth he had long ignored. The day had been unremarkable until that moment. Derek slid into the driver's seat of his sleek, black luxury car, a machine that symbolized all he had worked for. He glanced at his watch. Time was, as always, his most valuable asset. The engine purred to life, and he pulled out into traffic, weaving through the streets with practiced precision. His mind was elsewhere, thinking of a lucrative real estate deal that could push his net worth into the stratosphere. But as he sped through the crowded city, fate had other plans for him. On a corner, standing just out of sight, was Lana. Her clothes were worn, and her eyes tired from the weight of life's burdens. She clutched a small baby to her chest, the child wrapped in a thin, tattered blanket. Lana had once been someone too, someone with dreams, hopes, and a future. But now she was invisible to the people who walked past her, not even sparing her a glance. Today, she was just another homeless woman in a sea of faces, forgotten by society. Her arms tightened around the baby as the morning chill bit through the thin fabric of their clothes. Lana stepped off the curb, her thoughts on getting to the nearby shelter before it filled up for the day. The baby stirred in her arms, its small cries lost in the noise of the city. She looked down at the infant, offering a soft, reassuring hum. She didn't hear the car approaching, didn't see the blur of sleek black metal speeding toward her. In a split second, everything changed. Derek's car shot around the corner faster than it should have, and before he could react, before he could even comprehend what was happening, there was a sickening thud. The world seemed to slow down. The force of the impact knocked Lana off her feet, and she tumbled to the ground, the baby slipping from her arms and rolling onto the pavement. For a moment, there was only silence. The sound of Derek's brakes screeching to a halt broke the spell, and then came the screams. A crowd of onlookers rushed forward, some pulling out their phones to record the scene, while others ran to help the fallen woman and child. Derek sat frozen behind the wheel, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. He hadn't meant to hit her. He wasn't even going that fast, was he? His chest tightened as he saw the people gathering around. They were staring at him now, their faces a mixture of shock and anger. He knew what they were thinking. How could he have done this? Slowly, Derek pushed open the door and stepped out, his legs feeling weak beneath him. He could hear snippets of conversation, the accusing tones directed at him, but it was like he was underwater, everything muffled and distant. His eyes found Lana, crumpled on the ground, the baby lying a few feet away. Someone had already picked up the child and was trying to calm its frantic cries. Lana, on the other hand, wasn't moving. A woman knelt beside Lana, her face etched with concern. "She's breathing," the woman called out, looking up at Derek with a mixture of relief and accusation. "But she needs help, fast." Derek's heart pounded in his chest, guilt washing over him in waves. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to him. He was supposed to be the man in control, the man who had everything together. He took a step forward, but the crowd seemed to close in on him, their judgment heavy in the air. He heard someone call for an ambulance, and the sound of approaching sirens began to fill the distance. Time seemed to stretch out as Derek stood there, unsure of what to do, his mind a tangled mess of thoughts and emotions. He wasn't used to feeling this way, helpless, guilty. He had always been the man who fixed things, who made things happen. But here, on this street, surrounded by strangers who stared at him with contempt, Derek realized there were things money couldn't solve. The police arrived first, their flashing lights casting eerie reflections on the surrounding buildings. They quickly cordoned off the area, pushing back the growing crowd. One of the officers approached Derek, his face serious and unreadable. "Sir, I'm going to need to ask you a few questions," the officer said, his tone neutral but firm. Derek nodded, unable to find his voice. He glanced back at Lana, who was being lifted onto a stretcher by paramedics. The baby had been placed in the arms of a bystander who gently rocked the child back and forth. The scene was surreal, like something out of a nightmare. The officer's questions were a blur to Derek. He answered as best he could, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman lying unconscious on the stretcher. Who was she? Why had she been there? And why hadn't he seen her? As the ambulance pulled away, taking Lena and the baby with it, Derek felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, harder than anything he had ever faced. For the first time in his life, Derek wasn't sure if he could make this right. The crowd began to disperse, but Derek knew this was just the beginning. His life, so carefully built, had collided with another's in the most violent and unexpected way. He couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. And he was right. This moment would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone involved. As the ambulance sped away, sirens echoing through the city streets, Derek stood in the middle of the chaos, his world unraveling in ways he had never imagined. He watched the flashing lights disappear into the distance, feeling a hollow sensation in his chest. It was as if the weight of his carefully constructed life was crumbling, leaving him stranded in the aftermath of an incident that would forever define him. The officer in front of him cleared his throat, breaking Derek's dazed state. "Mr. Calloway, we need to take your statement. Can you walk us through what happened?" Derek opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Everything had happened so fast. The car, the woman, the baby, it all blurred together in his mind. He wasn't sure how to describe it. Instead, he nodded and tried to gather his thoughts. "It was an accident," he began, his voice hoarse. "I was turning the corner. I didn't see her until it was too late." The officer gave him a steady look, his notepad in hand, writing down every word. "Were you speeding, sir?" "No," Derek answered quickly, though he wasn't entirely sure. The truth was, he hadn't been paying attention. His mind had been elsewhere, lost in the details of his next business deal. And now, that lapse in focus had changed everything. "I wasn't going fast. I think she stepped off the curb suddenly." He stopped, realizing how weak his excuses sounded. The officer's face remained unreadable as he continued to scribble notes, but Derek could feel the eyes of the onlookers still lingering on him, judgment heavy in the air. The crowd had thinned, but there were still a few stragglers. Some whispered to one another, casting furtive glances at Derek. He could hear snippets of their conversation, and none of it was good. To them, he was just another rich man who didn't care about the people below him. Someone who could hit a homeless woman and walk away without consequences. It didn't matter that it had been an accident. In their eyes, he was guilty before anything had even been proven. The police, after what seemed like an eternity of questions, finally told Derek that he was free to go, at least for now. They took down his information, assured him that they'd be in touch, and warned him not to leave town. As the officers moved on, the tension around Derek only seemed to grow. He felt the weight of the city itself pressing down on him, as if every building, every window, and every person was watching his every move. He made his way back to his car, the sleek black vehicle that now felt more like a cage than a symbol of success. The driver's doors still hung open, the car parked awkwardly at the corner. A few bystanders had taken pictures, their phones flashing as they documented every detail of the incident. The damage wasn't visible on the car, just a small dent on the hood, But it was the damage he couldn't see that gnawed at him. The woman, the baby, he couldn't get the image out of his mind. As he sat in the driver's seat, his hands gripped the wheel, but he couldn't bring himself to start the engine. For the first time in years, Derek felt paralyzed, unsure of what to do next. He had always been the man with the answers, the man who could solve any problem thrown his way. But this wasn't a business deal. This wasn't something he could throw money at and fix. It was deeper than that. Something raw and emotional. Something that went against the core of who he thought he was. His phone buzzed, jolting him out of his thoughts. It was his assistant, reminding him of his next meeting. Derek ignored the message. For the first time, business didn't seem to matter. Nothing seemed to matter except the sinking feeling that everything had changed, and not for the better. He drove slowly, the city passing by in a blur. The faces of pedestrians became indistinct shapes as he replayed the moment over and over in his mind. Each time, it felt worse. Each time, he wondered what he could have done differently. Should he have seen her sooner? Was there something he missed? Finally, Derek pulled into the underground parking garage of his high-rise apartment building. The familiar setting did little to comfort him. He sat there, in the stillness of the garage, the engine off, but his mind racing. The weight of what had happened, of what he had done, bore down on him with a force he wasn't prepared to handle. Upstairs, his luxury penthouse awaited, pristine and perfect, a world apart from the chaos of the streets below. But as he entered his home, the opulence felt hollow. The grand windows overlooking the city, the marble floors, the fine art on the walls, it all seemed so meaningless now. For the first time, Derek felt a disconnect from the life he had built. His success had come at a price, and now that price was staring him in the face, in the form of a woman and her child, lying in a hospital because of him. He collapsed onto the sofa, his mind spinning. What would happen next? Would Lana survive? What about the baby? Questions he never thought he'd have to ask himself now filled his thoughts. His guilt deepened with each passing moment. He tried to shake it off, to tell himself that accidents happen, that he hadn't meant to hurt anyone, but the rationalization felt weak. It wasn't enough. Not this time. Unable to sit still, Derek found himself pacing the length of the penthouse, his thoughts a whirlwind. He grabbed the remote and flicked on the TV, hoping to distract himself. But as the screen lit up, he froze. There on the news was a grainy cell phone video of the accident. It had been posted online, and the media had already picked it up. The footage showed Lana stepping into the street, Derek's car hitting her. And the aftermath. It was all there, playing out for the world to see. The headline beneath the footage read, "Millionaire involved in shocking accident. Homeless woman and baby hospitalized." Derek's heart sank. This wasn't going to disappear. The media would hound him, and the public would demand justice. His reputation, carefully built over years, could crumble in an instant. But even that seemed like a distant concern compared to the guilt gnawing at him. It wasn't about his reputation anymore. It was about what he had done, the lives he had impacted. The phone rang again. This time, it was his lawyer. Derek answered, his voice shaky. The lawyer's tone was calm, professional, but there was an edge to it, the kind of tone that hinted at serious trouble. "Derek," the lawyer began, "we need to talk about what's coming next. This situation is complicated." Derek sat down, bracing himself for what he already knew. This was just the beginning. The lawyer outlined the potential legal consequences, the media storm that was brewing, and the damage control they would need to enact. But Derek only half listened. His mind kept drifting back to Lana, to the moment of impact, and to the look in the crowd's eyes as they judged him. The lawyer's voice faded as Derek stared out the window, the city's lights twinkling in the night. He had everything: wealth, power, success. But at that moment, it felt like he had nothing. What good was all his money if it couldn't erase the guilt, if it couldn't fix the damage he had done? Derek knew, deep down, that this wasn't something that would go away with a payout or a carefully crafted apology. This was something deeper. This was something he couldn't run from. Derek lay awake that night, the darkness pressing in around him like a weight. His mind wouldn't quiet. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the moment of the crash. The look of shock on Lana's face, the way she fell, the baby's helpless cries. He turned over in bed, staring at the ceiling, but no matter how he shifted, the unease gnawed at him. He had never felt anything like this before. He was a man of control, a man who made things happen on his own terms. But now he felt powerless, trapped by his own actions. The next morning, the city was buzzing with news of the accident. Derek woke to his phone ringing incessantly. Reporters, clients, even old friends, all wanting a statement, an explanation, something from him. He ignored them all. His lawyer had advised him to keep quiet, to let the legal team handle the situation. But Derek couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a legal problem. This was about who he was, about what he had done, and he didn't have an answer for that. He turned on the television again, knowing full well what he'd find. Every news channel was talking about him. The footage of the accident had gone viral. The headlines were brutal. Millionaire hits homeless mother and baby. Is money enough to escape justice? Some networks played the video on a loop, dissecting every frame, while others debated whether someone like Derek could ever truly face consequences for his actions. The public sentiment was harsh. People were calling for his head, demanding that he be held accountable. They didn't care about the nuances of the situation, or that it had been an accident. All they saw was a rich man who had harmed two vulnerable people, and that was enough to convict him in the court of public opinion. Derek sat on the edge of his bed, his phone in his hands, scrolling through the messages. Most were accusatory. Strangers calling him a monster, saying he should rot in prison. Some were from business associates, carefully crafted statements that said little but expressed concern about how this incident might impact future deals. There were even a few from people he hadn't spoken to in years, offering hollow words of comfort, as though they were just checking in to make sure they weren't too closely associated with the man who had become public enemy number one overnight. The only message he truly cared about, though, was from the hospital. Lana was still unconscious, but stable. The baby had suffered only minor injuries and was being cared for by social services until Lana could recover. Derek exhaled in relief, but it didn't last long. He knew that Lana's recovery wouldn't be the end of this. The damage had already been done. He decided to go to the hospital. He had no idea what he would say or how Lana would react if she woke up and saw him. But he felt an overwhelming need to see her, to try and make sense of what had happened. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was something deeper. But he had to go. When Derek arrived at the hospital, he was greeted by cold, sterile walls and the faint hum of machinery. The place felt like a different world, one far removed from the luxury and power he was used to. He asked at the front desk for Lana's room, half expecting to be turned away. But the nurse looked at him with thinly veiled recognition. She had seen the news, no doubt, and gave him the room number without a word. He stood outside her door for what felt like an eternity, his hand hovering over the handle. Through the small window, he could see Lana lying in the hospital bed, her face pale against the white sheets. The baby wasn't in the room, but a nurse occasionally stepped in to check on Lana's vitals. She looked fragile, broken, a far cry from the woman he had hit on the street just a day ago. He hadn't realized it in the chaos of the accident, but now, standing here, the gravity of what he had done hit him with full force. The door opened before he could gather the courage to knock. A nurse stepped out, nearly bumping into him. She paused, recognizing him instantly, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Are you here for her?" she asked, her voice flat. Derek nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yes. I wanted to check on her." The nurse eyed him for a moment, then gestured toward the room. "She's stable, but still unconscious. It might be a while before she wakes up, but you can go in if you want." Derek hesitated, then stepped inside. The room was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of the machines monitoring Lana's condition. He stood at the foot of her bed, unsure of what to do or say. There were no words that could fix this, no apology that would make it right. He had never felt so out of place in his life. Here was a woman who had lost everything, reduced to living on the streets with a baby in her arms, and there he was, a man who had everything but somehow still managed to hurt her. He sat down in the chair beside her bed, staring at the machines, the IV drip, the quiet rise and fall of her chest. He thought about the news reports, the outrage, the way the world had turned against him in an instant. But sitting here, none of that seemed to matter. The only thing that mattered was that he had nearly taken a life that, for all he knew, had already been through more hardship than he could ever imagine. Hours passed, and still Derek sat there, unmoving. His mind kept going back to the moment of impact, replaying it over and over like a nightmare he couldn't escape. He had always prided himself on being in control, on having the answers, but now he felt like a ship lost at sea, tossed around by forces he couldn't begin to understand. Eventually, a doctor came in, breaking the silence. He didn't seem surprised to find Derek there. He introduced himself, then gave Derek a quick update on Lana's condition. She had suffered a concussion, along with several broken ribs and a fractured leg, but they expected her to make a full recovery. The baby, thankfully, had only sustained minor bruises. Derek thanked the doctor, though the words felt hollow. Before the doctor left, he paused at the door. "You know, a lot of people have been asking about her," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But no one seems to know her. No family, no friends. It's like she's been forgotten." Derek didn't say anything, but the words hit him hard. Forgotten. That was exactly what had happened to Lana. She had slipped through the cracks of society, just another face in the crowd, invisible to people like him until it was too late. He had been so focused on his own world, his own success, that he hadn't seen the people right in front of him. The people like Lana, struggling to survive while he thrived. As the doctor left, Derek sat there, staring at Lana. He had thought that coming here would make him feel better, that seeing her alive would ease the guilt gnawing at him. But it hadn't. If anything, it had made it worse, because now he couldn't ignore the truth staring him in the face. He had done this. He had hurt her, and nothing would ever change that. But as he sat there, something shifted inside him. He realized that this wasn't just about guilt. It was about responsibility. For the first time in his life, Derek understood that he couldn't just walk away from this. He couldn't throw money at the problem and hope it would go away. He had to make things right, not just for Lana, but for himself. He didn't know what that meant yet, or how he would do it, but he knew one thing. His life would never be the same again. Derek stood up, glancing at Lana one last time before leaving the room. As he walked down the sterile hospital hallway, a sense of purpose began to form in his mind. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he was determined to follow it, no matter what it cost him. Derek couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had irrevocably shifted. After leaving the hospital, the cold wind of the city swept against his face, but it didn't numb the thoughts racing through his mind. He had spent years cultivating an image. Derek Calloway, the untouchable, the self-made millionaire who stood above the noise and chaos of the world. He had prided himself on his independence, on his ability to rise above the struggles that plagued everyone else. Yet here he was, entangled in something he couldn't control, something that gnawed at the very core of who he was. He had hurt someone, and not just anyone. He had hurt Lana, a woman he once knew. It had taken him a full day after the accident to recognize her. But as he sat in his penthouse that night, her face in the hospital bed sparked memories buried deep in his past. He had gone to high school with her, though their paths had crossed only briefly. Lana had been the kind of girl everyone noticed, smart, ambitious, with a radiant energy that drew people to her. She had plans, big ones. Derek remembered overhearing her talk about becoming a journalist or maybe a lawyer. She had been the type of person who seemed destined for success, just like him. And now, years later, here she was, homeless, broken, with a baby that wasn't even her own. How had it come to this? He needed to know more. Derek couldn't shake the questions that swirled in his mind, couldn't simply accept that life had just happened to her. There had to be a story, a reason why someone like Lana had fallen so far. His curiosity, mingled with the guilt that continued to plague him, drove him to action. He decided to hire a private investigator to find out what had happened to her. It wasn't just about easing his conscience anymore. He needed to understand how someone who had once been so full of promise could end up on the streets. Days passed, and the media frenzy surrounding the accident only intensified. Reporters camped outside his building, eager for any scraps of information they could use to further fuel the public outrage. Derek remained a virtual prisoner in his own home, avoiding interviews, ignoring calls, and waiting for updates from his lawyer. But no amount of legal advice could prepare him for the storm brewing on the horizon. The lawsuit was inevitable. Lana's medical bills, combined with the public pressure, ensured that. His lawyer assured him that they could settle it quietly, that with the right amount of money, they could make the whole thing disappear. But Derek wasn't interested in making this go away. He wanted to face it head-on, to take responsibility in a way he had never done before. One evening, after yet another day of avoiding the outside world, Derek's phone buzzed with a text from the private investigator. The message was simple. "I've got something. We need to talk." They met in a dimly lit cafe, far from the prying eyes of the media. Derek sat in a booth, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He barely noticed when the investigator slid into the seat across from him, a folder clutched in his hand. The man, middle-aged and grizzled from years of digging into other people's lives, gave Derek a grim nod before opening the folder. "What you asked for," the investigator said quietly, laying out a series of documents and photos on the table. "Her story isn't what you'd expect." Derek leaned in, his eyes scanning the papers. He saw old yearbook photos, reports, and court records. As the investigator spoke, Derek pieced together Lana's tragic fall from grace. It turned out that after high school, Lana had followed her dreams. She had gone to college, graduated with honors, and even landed a prestigious job at a law firm. For a while, everything seemed perfect. She had a promising career, a supportive husband, and a future that looked bright. But then, things took a dark turn. Her husband, a man named Tom, had been diagnosed with cancer, and within 2 years, the disease had taken him from her. The medical bills had drained their savings, and Lana had been forced to sell their home to pay off the debt. Alone and grieving, she had tried to keep her life together, but the weight of it all had been too much. Without any family to support her, Lana had fallen into a deep depression. She lost her job, couldn't afford rent, and eventually found herself on the streets. The baby, Derek learned, wasn't hers. It belonged to a friend of hers, another homeless woman who had disappeared one night without a trace. Lana had taken it upon herself to care for the child, refusing to let the baby face the same hopelessness she had endured. That's how Derek had found her, standing on that street corner, clutching the baby in her arms, as though it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. Derek stared at the investigator, his mind spinning with the weight of it all. This wasn't just some random accident. This was a collision of 2 lives, both shaped by choices and circumstances, but with drastically different outcomes. Lana's story was a reminder of how fragile life could be, how easily it could slip away from you without warning. And for Derek, who had built his fortune on control and power, it was a stark reminder that he wasn't immune to the unpredictability of life. "She's been through hell," the investigator said, folding his arms as he sat back in the booth. "I'm not sure what you plan to do with this information, but I figured you should know." Derek thanked him and left the cafe, the folder tucked under his arm like a weight he couldn't shake. He wandered the city streets, his mind reeling from the gravity of Lana's story. For so long, he had distanced himself from the struggles of others, seeing poverty and hardship as things that happened to other people, not to him. But now, it was personal. He couldn't ignore it any longer. As the days passed, Derek's guilt transformed into something else, an urgent need to make things right. He returned to the hospital, determined to see Lana again, this time with a plan. But when he arrived, he was met with an unexpected surprise. Lana was awake. She was sitting up in bed, her eyes scanning the room as though trying to piece together where she was. When Derek stepped into the room, their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Lana's face was gaunt, her eyes tired, but there was a flicker of recognition in them. She remembered him. Of course she would. They had shared a past, however distant it may have been. Derek approached cautiously, unsure of how to begin, unsure of what to say. I didn't know it was you," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. Lana didn't respond at first. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice raspy and weak. "Does it matter?" Derek froze, the weight of her words sinking in. Did it matter? He wasn't sure how to answer. It should matter. It should change everything. But standing here, in this hospital room, he realized that what mattered wasn't the fact that they had once known each other. What mattered was what he did next. "I'm sorry," he said, the words hanging in the air between them. It felt inadequate, but it was all he had. Lana closed her eyes, leaning back against the pillows. "Sorry doesn't change anything." Derek nodded, understanding now what needed to be done. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could change what came next. This wasn't just about making amends for the accident. It was about giving Lana the chance she deserved, the chance that had been stolen from her by circumstances beyond her control. He made a decision, right there in that hospital room, that would alter the course of both their lives. Derek would use every resource at his disposal to help Lana get back on her feet, not as charity, but as an acknowledgement of the humanity they both shared. He would make sure that the world didn't forget her, the way it had before. And in doing so, he knew that he would be forced to confront the parts of himself he had long ignored. The parts that cared, the parts that could feel, the parts that had been buried beneath years of ambition and success. This wasn't about fixing his image or settling a lawsuit. This was about redemption, about finding a way to live with himself after everything that had happened. For the first time in his life, Derek Calloway was choosing to do something not for profit or gain, but because it was the right thing to do. And in that decision, he found a sense of purpose he had never known before. The decision Derek made in that hospital room set off a chain of events he could never have anticipated. The following days were a whirlwind of phone calls, meetings, and plans, all focused on one thing: helping Lana rebuild her life. Derek wasn't sure if Lana would ever forgive him, and he wasn't even sure if forgiveness was something he could ask for. But he knew that he couldn't just walk away, couldn't leave her to fend for herself in a world that had already taken so much from her. This wasn't just about the accident anymore. It was about something far deeper, about how two lives, once on completely different trajectories, had collided in a way neither could have predicted. The first thing Derek did was clear Lana's medical bills. It was a small gesture, one that took nothing from him financially, but it was a start. Lana was a proud woman. He knew this from the brief conversations they'd had during her recovery. She didn't want charity, didn't want to be seen as another tragic case for someone like Derek to fix. But Derek wasn't offering charity. He saw it as a responsibility, a debt he owed not just to her but to himself. It wasn't enough to write a check and call it a day. Derek wanted to help her in a way that would last, in a way that would restore her dignity, her life. He hired a social worker, someone with experience in housing and job placement, to assist Lana once she was discharged from the hospital. Derek made sure Lana had a place to stay, a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood. far from the streets she had once called home. At first, Lana resisted. She didn't trust his motives, couldn't quite believe that someone like him would do something without expecting something in return. It took time for her to accept his help, and even longer for her to accept that he wasn't doing this to make himself feel better. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. As the days passed, Derek and Lana's relationship shifted. It was no longer just about the accident or the circumstances that had brought them together. They began to talk, really talk, about their lives, their pasts, and the choices that had led them to this point. Lana shared more of her story with him, opening up about her husband, Tom, and the slow, painful decline of their life together after his cancer diagnosis. Derek listened, realizing just how little he had understood about the world outside his own bubble of success and privilege. He had always believed that people ended up where they were because of the choices they made. But hearing Lana's story, he understood that sometimes life didn't give you a choice. Sometimes the world came crashing down, and there was nothing you could do but try to survive. It wasn't long before the media got wind of Derek's actions. Reporters who had once camped outside his building, eager to catch a glimpse of the disgraced millionaire, now framed their stories in a different light. Headlines shifted from "Millionaire hits homeless woman" to "Derek Calloway's redemption," helping the homeless mother he hurt. The public's opinion of him slowly began to change. People who had once condemned him now saw him as someone trying to make amends, someone who had learned from his mistakes. But Derek didn't care about the headlines. He didn't care about the redemption arc the media was crafting for him. All he cared about was making sure that Lana got the chance she deserved. Still, not everyone was on board with Derek's transformation. His inner circle, business associates, former friends, were less than thrilled with the attention he was getting. Some saw his actions as a distraction, a deviation from the hard-nosed, success-driven image that had made him so powerful in the first place. They warned him that this newfound focus on helping Lana and others like her would damage his reputation in the long run. Clients began to pull out of deals, worried that Derek's soft spot for social causes would interfere with his ability to make tough business decisions. They questioned his judgment, his priorities, and some even suggested that he was doing all of this for the publicity, to salvage his brand. Derek knew that wasn't true. He had built his empire on ruthless ambition, and he had no illusions about the business world's appetite for compassion. But for the first time, he didn't care about the bottom line. He didn't care about maintaining an image that no longer felt true to who he was. He could live with losing clients, with losing money, but he couldn't live with the man he had been before the accident. He couldn't go back to being the person who walked past people like Lana, pretending they didn't exist. The backlash from his business community didn't stop him. If anything, it strengthened his resolve. Derek started to put more of his resources into helping not just Lana but others like her. He used his connections to create a foundation aimed at supporting those who had fallen through the cracks. People who, like Lana, had once been full of promise but had been beaten down by life's hardships. The foundation focused on housing, job training, and mental health services, giving people the tools they needed to rebuild their lives. At first, Derek had thought this would be a quiet endeavor, something he could do without drawing too much attention. But it wasn't long before the foundation took on a life of its own. People began to reach out. Donors, volunteers, even other business leaders who had once turned a blind eye to these issues. The more Derek put into the foundation, the more it grew. He started to see the ripple effects of his actions, how helping one person could lead to helping an entire community. As the foundation expanded, Derek found himself spending more time away from the world he had once dominated. His penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a relic of a past life. He visited Lana often, though their relationship remained complicated. She was grateful for his help, but there was still a distance between them, a gulf created by their different experiences of the world. Derek didn't push. He understood that it would take time. Time for Lana to trust him fully. Time for her to rebuild her own life, without feeling like she owed him anything. One day, as Derek sat in his office reviewing the latest reports from the foundation, he received a call from Lana. She hadn't called him directly before, so he immediately picked up, his heart racing with the uncertainty of what she might say. "I found her," Lana said, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of emotion. "Found who?" Derek asked, confused. "The baby's mother," Lana replied. "She's alive." The revelation hit Derek like a shockwave. The baby, who had been at the center of this whole tragedy, wasn't even Lana's child. Yet Lana had cared for her, protected her, as if she were her own. Derek had assumed the mother was gone, either lost to the streets or worse. But now, the story had taken another unexpected turn. Lana explained that she had been searching for the baby's mother ever since she'd regained her strength. The woman, a fellow homeless woman named Julie, had disappeared shortly after the accident. It turned out she had been admitted to a different hospital, suffering from a severe illness. Lana had finally tracked her down, and now they were working to reunite her with her child. Derek listened, stunned by the news. This wasn't the twist he had expected, but it was a reminder of how intertwined people's lives could be, how one small act of kindness or cruelty could ripple out in ways no one could predict. After they ended the call, Derek sat back in his chair, staring out the window at the city below. The skyline, once a symbol of his power, now seemed distant, almost irrelevant. His life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. He had lost clients, lost money, and lost the man he used to be. But he had gained something far more valuable: a sense of purpose, a sense of responsibility to the world around him. He had helped Lana find her footing, had built something that would last far beyond his own lifetime. But the most important change had been within himself. Derek Calloway, the untouchable millionaire, had finally found something worth fighting for. As he stood and looked out at the city, Derek knew that his journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, more setbacks, more difficult choices. But for the first time in his life, he was ready to face them, not as the man he had been, but as the man he had become. Derek found himself standing at a crossroads. Everything he had known, everything he had built, seemed to be slipping through his fingers, yet for the first time, he didn't feel afraid. There was a strange sense of calm that had settled over him. The man who had once measured his life by the success of his business deals, by the power he wielded, now stood on the precipice of something far more meaningful. The foundation was growing faster than he could have imagined, and the call from Lana about the baby's mother had added another layer to the complex web of relationships that had formed since the accident. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, not with the high-powered business executives he used to court, but with community leaders, social workers, and advocates. Derek was building something new, something he had never envisioned for himself. The foundation had become a force for change in the city, helping hundreds of people find shelter, access mental health services, and rebuild their lives. Yet for Derek, this was only the beginning. He was no longer content with just throwing money at the problem. He wanted to be in the trenches, working alongside the people his foundation served, learning their stories, and finding real solutions. Lana had become a key figure in this movement. Once reluctant to accept Derek's help, she had now embraced the role of advocate for the homeless, working with the foundation to connect with those still struggling on the streets. She had healed physically from the accident, though the emotional scars remained. Derek often saw her at the foundation's offices, working tirelessly, never asking for anything in return. She had found a new purpose, much like Derek, and their relationship, while still complicated, had grown into one of mutual respect. One afternoon, Derek received a call from Lana, asking him to meet her at a shelter on the edge of the city. When he arrived, he found her sitting with Julie, the baby's mother. Julie was gaunt, her eyes hollow from the years she had spent on the streets, but there was a light in her face that hadn't been there before. She held the baby, close, her arms wrapped tightly around the child, as if she would never let go again. Julie's story, like Lana's, was one of tragedy and survival. She had been a victim of domestic abuse, fleeing with her newborn to escape a violent partner. With nowhere to go, she had ended up on the streets, invisible to the world around her. When she fell ill, she had no choice but to leave the baby with Lana, hoping she would return. But weeks turned into months, and by the time she was well enough to seek help, she had no idea where to find her child. Derek listened as Julie told her story, feeling the familiar pull of guilt and responsibility. This was the world he had ignored for so long, the people he had passed by without a second thought. After reuniting with her child, Julie had decided to turn her life around. With help from the foundation, she had secured a job and was working towards finding permanent housing. She looked at Derek with a mix of gratitude and awe, as if she couldn't quite believe that a man like him had been the catalyst for this change. But Derek shook his head, refusing to take the credit. "It wasn't me," he said softly, glancing at Lana. "It was all of us." The media had started to shift its focus, too. Once filled with stories of Derek's fall from grace, they were now chronicling his transformation and the foundation's success. But despite the positive coverage, Derek remained wary of the public's fickle nature. He wasn't doing this for recognition, and he didn't trust the headlines to last. What mattered now was the work, the impact, and the people whose lives were being changed. One evening, Derek found himself sitting in his penthouse, staring out at the city that had once represented everything he aspired to be. The skyline glittered with promise, but it no longer held the same allure. He thought about all the years he had spent climbing the ladder, pushing aside anyone who stood in his way, convinced that success was defined by the number in his bank account. But now, his wealth felt hollow, disconnected from the reality he had come to understand. He had spent his life chasing something that had never brought him peace, and it took hitting rock bottom, quite literally, for him to see what truly mattered. The foundation had given him a new sense of purpose, but it also forced him to confront the person he had been. Derek had been ruthless, indifferent, and in many ways, selfish. He had been so focused on his own ambitions that he had ignored the suffering of those around him, the struggles that existed just beyond his line of sight. But now, every face he saw reminded him of how easy it was to fall, how close he had come to becoming just another story of wealth gone wrong. As the days turned into weeks, Derek's role in the foundation deepened. He found himself spending more time in shelters, speaking with people who had lost everything, hearing their stories, and realizing just how fragile the line between success and failure really was. The more he listened, the more he understood that his money, while helpful, wasn't the solution. What people needed was compassion, dignity, and a chance to rebuild on their own terms. One of the most profound moments came when Lana, Julie, and Derek stood together at a community event organized by the foundation. It was a celebration of the progress they had made, but also a reminder of how much work still needed to be done. Derek watched as Lana took the stage, speaking to a crowd of people who had come to hear her story. She spoke with a quiet strength, telling them about her journey, about the accident that had changed her life, and about how she had found hope again through the foundation. "I was lost," Lana said, her voice carrying through the crowd. "I didn't think anyone would ever see me again. I thought I'd fade away, forgotten by the world. But here I am. And it's not because someone saved me. It's because someone gave me the chance to save myself." Derek felt a lump in his throat as he listened to her words. This was what it was all about, giving people the chance to find their own way, to reclaim their lives after everything had been taken from them. It wasn't about him or his wealth. It was about creating a space where people could rise up, where they could rebuild. As the event wound down, Derek stood off to the side, watching the crowd disperse. Julie approached him, the baby in her arms. She smiled, a tired but genuine smile, and nodded her thanks. "You've done more than you know," she said softly. Derek shook his head, still uncomfortable with the praise. "I didn't do this for gratitude," he said. "I did it because I had to." Julie studied him for a moment, then smiled again. "Maybe. But you're still here, and that counts for something. As Julie walked away, Derek felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He had made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but he had also learned from them. He had taken responsibility in a way he never thought possible, and in doing so, he had found a path forward. That night, as he lay in bed, Derek thought back to the accident, to the moment everything had changed. It had been a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone involved. Lana had found her way back, Julie had reunited with her child, and Derek had discovered something he had never known he was searching for, a purpose beyond wealth and power. In the quiet of the night, Derek closed his eyes, a single question lingering in his mind, the same question he had been asked months ago by Lana. Does it matter? And now, after everything, he finally had an answer. Yes, it mattered. Every choice, every action, every life. It all mattered. And now, for the first time in his life, Derek Calloway was no longer afraid to face the consequences of that truth.